Hi, baby boomer fans. We are Jackie and Janine, the Pfeiffer sisters, and love to talk about the 1950s, inviting you to reminisce with us as we explore experiences of that decade. Grab your favorite malt or Green River. Make sure you are wide awake and get ready to be inspired about the 1950s. Welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat. Hello there, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is always a great time for us when we can record the memories of someone who is reminded of a life in the 1950s or in the 1960s. And today, our Fun Chat guest is the interview is a little bit different twist to it. And because the person about whom we are interested in learning is a gentleman who is recently deceased, and so his daughter has agreed to come on and just tell us all about him and his wife, and we're so excited about this. So Jackie, where can you take us from there?
Well, greetings. Hello, everyone. I do want to mention that little purple strip below that you're watching on this page. It is our website, www.whilethewindmillwatch.com. And we invite you to go there to learn more about the authors, the book, the vendors who sell the book, the events where you will find the sisters, and this 1950s Fun Chat. Janine, what number is this?
This is number 112.
Woohoo! So you can
keep forging ahead.
You may look at all of the fun chats there, and we know you'll find many of them of interest to you. Also, up in the look at the upper right-hand corner, you will see a copy of our book, While the Windmill Watched, a Slice of Rural America in the 1950s. You'll see a beautiful North Dakota sunset, which wraps around the book, and you'll also see a little white dot on the bottom. And that was a little prize that the book got in 2022. The book was published in 21. Next year, it was awarded the National Independent Press Award in the regional nonfiction category as the distinguished favorite. So let's get on with the show. We're going to introduce you to Mary Ann Michels. Now, Mary Ann Michels was born in Bismarck, North Dakota in 1958. She graduated from Bismarck High School in 1976, from Bismarck Junior College in 1978, and then Iowa State University in 1980 with a degree in textiles and clothing. She became employed by Northwest Fabrics and traveled the Midwest managing stores, eventually relocating to Fort Collins, Colorado, to run the Western region for Northwest Fabrics. Her travels led her to meet her husband, Peter Stackhouse, in Omaha, Nebraska, while managing her first store. Once their children, Max and Teresa, were born, she was lucky enough to stay home with them. They are now both married and had given Mary Ann and her husband 2 beautiful granddaughters. Mary Ann has been a real estate agent for the last 15 years, a job that she loves. Her dad, Clair Michels, lived with them for 12 years until he passed away last December at the age of 105. Now, Mary Ann and Peter reside in Fort Collins, Colorado at the present time. So, Mary Ann, welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat.
Thank you for having me, ladies.
You're welcome. We look forward to this, as we look forward to all, because everyone has a story, and we are interested in hearing it. So, to begin with, the capacity to have an effect on the character development or behavior of someone is a great responsibility of parents. So let's begin by having you discuss how your parents influenced you in so many aspects of your life.
Well, my goodness. Well, thanks for having me. My mom, Lois Michels, and Clair Michels, they met in high school in northeastern Montana, Plentywood High, and were high school sweethearts, married a few years after high school. But, they went through so much. They were from those farm ranching families that struggled in the early 1900s, graduating from high school in the 30s, World War II breaking out. My dad was in the Army Air Corps. My mom was a nurse. And not only was she also got her public health, so she had her master's degree, which is amazing for that time. Yeah. So I always watched a strong female mom figure, and I had a wonderful, soft, loving dad as well. But they were hard workers and never made a ton of money in their life, but people glued up to them, loved being around them because they were fun, and caring, and always thought about the other person. And that's something I've always tried to do.
Marianne, we were drawn to have you as a guest on our show because Jackie and I have a faint memory of the man who is named Clair Michels and was associated with the North Dakota Stockmen's Association.
Right.
We were living at Minokan in our childhood in North Dakota, and our dad was a member of the Stockmen's Association. Our mom was a cowbell. And can you get into and tell us about what brought your parents to North Dakota and to Bismarck then?
Right. Well, my dad graduated post World War II. He used the GI Bill in Bozeman, Montana, MSU, and he had gone to 2 years before the war broke out, and he got his degree in agriculture education. And he said it was really kind of sad for those boys that were 20, 18, 19 that were going to school. And then here came the GI Bill people. And they were, 27, 28, 29, and they were ready to get their degree and move on. So he was a good student. And, those younger kids were having to buckle up to those older guys that were really determined, So he talks about that. So after they graduated, they actually went back. After he graduated, they actually went back to the ranch, and his older brother asked him to be the ranch manager. So this was in northeastern Montana by Reserve, Montana. And so they did that for 2 years, hauling. My mom, beautiful cook, always, hauling out the food for the combine crew or whatever, so they did that. But he went on to be a county agent in Montana. He was in the state legislature in Montana. So he was kind of a Renaissance guy who was willing to try a lot of different things. The Hereford Journal picked him up and wanted him to travel and sell space in their magazine and run bull sales. And so he did that. They moved to Sheridan, Wyoming. My mom, since she was a nurse, could always find a job. And so she had a job there at the hospital. And he traveled from Saskatchewan down to New Mexico, running bull sales up and down and writing, advertising. And 2 years of that, my mom said, "When are you going to quit this damn job? And you don't have to be on the road all the time." I mean, he was on the road, 330 days a year or whatever. He really kind of made a name for himself, I think. He was a gentleman. He was willing to always listen. He was so knowledgeable. He was a good guy to be around. And he was sought after by North Dakota, the North Dakota Stockmen's Association. So they had him come up and interview, and they really wanted him to come and run the organization. So in 1958, he and my mom moved up to Bismarck and rented a little house until they could buy a house. And they bought on the corner of 4th and Boulevard, which is right next to the governor's mansion. She had always, admired this beautiful kind of Tudor house. And so that's how he got there. And I was born in 1958. And so it was a great new start for the family.
When he became an executive vice president, is that correct?
And at the time, they called it the executive secretary. Okay. And I think they elevated the name later to executive vice president. Of course, there was always a cowboy that was the president every year.
And what were his main responsibilities then when he came?
Oh, my goodness. So, I actually have a note here of what he wrote. He wrote his obituary. He updated it every couple years. And what a guy. He didn't want to impress upon it, but it says he served the beef, cattle, and livestock industry faithfully for 25 years in many state and national capacities, including brand inspection, law enforcement, beef promotion, public relations, legislation, and administration. And he won many awards too. The Agriculturist Year of the Award, this from NDSU. He was named to the Northern International Livestock Exposition and Billings, et cetera, et cetera. But he was in charge of the magazine. He was in charge of hiring an editor. He was in charge of the brand inspectors. He would go up and work when legislature was going on, work in beef and beef related bills that were coming either in the state or even nationally. So he, just like what's happening today. Well, and they wanted to build a building, and so it's kind of cute. He always told this story about the Cowboys all said, "We want a Western architecture building in Bismarck." And he couldn't figure out what Western architecture was, what is this? He went to a conference in Vail and he took this picture of this cute little kind of chateau looking building, came back, showed it to the board of directors, and they said, "That's it. That's what we want." And so they built that beautiful building that they have, that they're using now, but now they're in a new campaign and building a new building.
Where's, just out of curiosity, where is that building located in Bismarck?
I actually had it written down. Where is that? It's So first they were on 5th and Main, which was, they rented a place on 5th and Main above the Ford garage. That's what I remember as a little girl in the late 50s and 60s. And then I think it's at 7th Street. It's down by the Kirkwood Mall,
Okay.
There. Yeah. That's where it currently is. But they're building up north now.
Okay. And when you got to go with him to his office, what did you do?
Oh, it was so awesome. Saturday mornings, he would go in and finish up things and always take me on a Saturday morning. He had an office with a big conference table whenever his board would meet. And I would be there with paper and pencils and crayons and whatever, depending on how old I was. And it was just fun to be in his habitat while he was doing his stuff at his desk. But then we would also probably go to the printer, because depending on if he had an editor at the time or if he needed to do the magazine himself that month, we would go to the editor. He'd have everything, cut apart and picture here. It was different than now, where you can import a PDF and come up with, your slicks. He had to just kind of do it all by hand at that time. So it was always great. It was always great to be with my dad. I also went on cattle tours with him and my mom. Sometimes, you go see so-and-so's cattle ranch and their range. I hung on to my first electric fence at one of those. Learned about that.
Yes.
Because I was a city girl. I was in Bismarck. We weren't living on a ranch at that time. So I learned a few things along the way. But I always remember being in the back seat with all my stuff and okay, get out. We're at so-and-so's pasture. We need to get out and look at these these beef cattle.
Did you have any siblings?
I didn't. And what's interesting is I hadn't even thought about telling this, but I think I will. And that is, I'm adopted. And when my parents came in 1958, they had always wanted to have children. My mother couldn't have children. And they had, my dad tells the story that some cattleman from North Dakota came in and sat down and said, "Claire, we understand you wanted children. And we have a young girl in our town that has a baby she wants to give up, and she's pregnant."
Wow.
And that's how it all happened. And she actually came to live with my parents because she was from a little town, no hospital. And she came to live with my parents for about a month before delivery. And since my mom was a nurse, she was in the delivery room. My dad was at the Gourmet. Do you remember the Gourmet?
Yes.
He was at the Gourmet entertaining, some of the cattlemen. And the waitress came over and said, "Congratulations, Claire, you have a girl." And they said, "What are you doing here? You should be at the hospital with your wife." And he said, "Well, we're adopting." So yeah. So I am an only child and potentially spoiled. I don't know.
Oh no. It seems as though you had the best of you had this wonderfully loving these father, especially, and your mother as well, that's
Right. Yeah.
that.
I was a lucky girl.
Yes, you were. Yes, yeah.
And your
Are.
childhood, yeah, and your childhood living on 4th and Boulevard.
Yeah.
Of course, that your residence was right across the street from the governor's mansion. And
Right.
you had a special playmate who lived in that governor's
Yeah,
mansion.
Nancy Guy was a very special playmate. We went to the same grade school, junior high, high school. And what's funny is her dad was in office for so long. I always thought that was just the way it was, that a governor would be there for 20 years or something, But yes, and we had many sleepovers and play dates in the governor's mansion. All you'd have to do is go up and knock on the door and you come on in. I'm sure there's a little more security now these days at the governor's mansion and the new mansion. I had a little play fort in the backyard that my dad built out of some old windows. And Jean Guy, Nancy said, my mom can make curtains. So we went up and talked to her mom, and she says, oh, I've got some old muslin. And so she made curtains for our little playhouse. So that was really fun. And of course, Governor Bill Guy was good friends with my dad. They both worked together on different things in the legislature and were very amicable with one another too. So.
Can you recall any specific piece of legislation that your dad really wanted passed?
It's interesting that in I found this piece that my dad wrote, and he talked about all the major achievements. And what's so interesting is I'm sure my dad had a huge hand in every single pieces of those legislature. But when he wrote these paragraphs, he talked about the president that year and how the president of the North Dakota Stockmen Association got this through. I know my dad was instrumental in all of this, but he was always honoring and lifting up that other person and saying, look what he did, you know what I mean? But he talks about one major achievement was the passage of the 1964 Beef Import Act. It was a long and hard fight in Congress, he said. The cattle industry was fortunate to have Brooks, I can't remember how you say his name, K-R-O.
Keel. Oh, no.
Yeah.
Brooks Keel, wasn't it?
I think it was Keel, but it never looked like Keel, when you read it.
Brooks Keel.
So he lifted, he said, much credit due to Brooks for his ability and his leadership in the passage of the act. Another achievement was for the cattle industry was the association's efforts to repeal the North Dakota personal property tax in 1967 legislation. And then again, he lifts up the president at that time, who was Delbert Moore, who came to our house for dinner many times. So he said much of the credit goes to Delbert for doing that. So those were a couple of the things that he worked on. The cattle industry always had a lot of obstacles that they were facing, whether it was brand inspecting, imports, trying to kind of limit the imports that were happening. If you look over my shoulder, you can see this beautiful cowboy.
Yes.
And my dad was supposed to go to Italy in the 70s for an international kind of beef conference. And there were some serious issues that he needed to attend to at the Stockmen's Association, so he was unable to go. And so he sent the president that year. And I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was Odd Ostrus. I'm almost sure it was Odd. Do you remember the Ostrus family?
No, just the name.
And Odd bought this for my dad. It's a beautiful sculpture from a famous Italian artist. But he carried it on his lap on the way back because my dad had sent Odd to go do it, go get the opportunity. So my dad never really made it into Italy before, but we have this beautiful sculpture that came back.
Yes.
Nice. It reminds me of one I've seen by a Montana artist, but
okay.
But I was going to ask about that, but okay.
Well, Remington was my dad's favorite Western artist, Remington. He was a Montana boy, and he was my dad. Remington, not Rem.
Remington's from South Dakota, isn't he?
Oh, for crying out loud. I've just lost the name. I have it right here. Let's see. Well, anyway, he loved Western art. My dad was a jack of all trades.
He corresponded a lot with the pen
Yep.
and paper.
Yep.
Do you recall any of those special letters that he might have written to Stockmen, or even that he would have written to you?
Yeah. You know, my mother was a fabulous letter writer, and I have a box of the letters that she wrote to her sister when I was growing up. You could probably put it into a book. I mean, just for my own sake, they were beautiful. My dad was busy working and probably a few less letters at that time. But my mom died at 73, and so he took over all of that, took over and wrote these beautiful Christmas letters, many times relaying stories of the past pioneer times of his parents or his growing up. And he kept writing and writing and writing. He wrote a many letters to Julie Ellingson, who is the current Stockmen's vice president and runs the Stockmen's Association now. I didn't even know he did that. He was so proud that there was a woman running the organization and that she was so capable. And I visited her for the first time last summer when we went back to bury my dad's ashes. And she's such a lovely person, but she talked about the influence and never even having met him, you know, just these letters that he would send of encouragement. He wrote to, you know, his siblings. He was the last to go of 11. And so but I have a lot of cousins, if you can imagine, with 11 children. So he remembered every birthday. He would write letters of encouragement to them, to grandnieces. He would find out there might be a little hardship going on. He would write a letter of encouragement. He was just such a positive guy and always thinking outward.
You know what I think would be so neat, Marianne and Jackie, is if someone watching our fun chat recalls that their parents, their family had received a letter from Clair Michels, and if how that impacted their family, or if they still have that letter. Wouldn't that be fun to know?
Yeah.
And if so, just put it in the comments, please. We'd love to know about that.
And we just it's a little bit of a lost art, isn't it?
It is.
You know, to send a handwritten note, even as a small note. And I will say that is a thing that I do now, is I try to send handwritten notes every week. They go out to folks.
You know, children today some of them are not even taught cursive.
Right.
So, and so that means that sitting down and thinking about something is kind of lost too.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're thinking about.
You're just still used to typing.
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm talking about thinking of children. So
sometimes
they don't have the opportunity.
we will get handwritten notes from our older grandchildren. And I always think it's kind of cute because our granddaughter always makes sure that their dog paw print
Cute.
as well.
I like that. I like
another
that.
way too. So go ahead, Jackie. Oh,
No,
Marianne.
no.
Okay, Marianne.
Marianne was going to say something.
You know, I was going to tell you a little something about my parents when they were really young, and some of the stories that they had, one for each of them. My dad went to high school in 1931, and it was 22 miles south of their ranch. So their parents had traded some of the farm, eggs, etc., for 3 of the boys to live in a room. And he talks about how he was sent with his father's slippers and a pair of hand-me-down pants, and how embarrassed he was to go to school. He used those slippers to go to school. You know, when you think of, you know, how they struggled at that time and just to make ends meet, although they were pretty wealthy according to standards, because they did everything, you know, on the ranch. They had it all, so they could be self-sufficient and help others as well. My mom talks about, so my mom, when she was about 9, they moved to northeastern Montana because her dad had passed away and her grandparents were there. And so they were living in the grandparents' home. And she talks about opening up a trunk and finding this beautiful quilt inside. And she took out the quilt and was opening it up. And of course, her grandmother walked in and said, "What are you doing? What are you doing in my, trunk?" Which of course she loved my mother, and that became her quilt later, and I still have that quilt. Quilts were such a story back then. And being in the fabric industry, I've always loved the fabrics of the quilts. I love collecting them. I like making them, but I don't have a lot of time right now. But quilts are really a story of the early pioneer days.
They are. And when do you have this ability that you look at an old quilt and you can tell what era by the way the fabrics are printed or woven?
Well, I have a little sense of it. I have a little sense of it just from my fabric background, but I'm not an expert.
Was there a specific look to the cottons of the cotton fabrics of the 1950s that you can recall?
Well, I think the 50s, they were really about printed fabrics. So the quilt that my great grandmother gave my mom was blue and white. So it was just very simple, lovely. But I feel like by the time the 50s rolled around, everybody was so into the printed cotton. And so it was, colorful and, that I feel like that's what we really saw more of in the 50s.
Maybe that had, and so that maybe influenced why the feed grain sacks were fabric and they were printed floral or
right.
Floral,
Absolutely. And they switched from just the plain sacks to the very floral. Yeah.
Right. Yep. Because
in what era was it that cotton mills started producing prints reminiscent of the 1930s and 40s? That was
definitely in the 60s. We had all the flower power going on in the 60s, but then they also toned it down with gunny sack dresses in the early 70s. So all those prints really happened. So gunny sack, isn't that the funniest name for a dress company?
Yes.
So why? What's the history of that word, gunny
sack? I'm not sure.
Need to Google it, I guess.
Yeah.
That was a unique look. They had that gunny sacks company. That was unique for that.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think either you liked it, you were of that personality, or you weren't.
Right, because it was a real definite style for sure.
I love that. Yes.
Yeah.
Do you have more stories about your dad?
Well, he in retirement, it's funny, he retired in 1983 at 65. And later, years later, he would say, "I really didn't have to retire that young. I really could have stayed on for a few more years." But my mom died at 73. And so he always said, "I have no regrets. Look at all the travel that we got to do." And they traveled all over the United States in those 8 years. So that was a plus. But whenever I'm a realtor now, and he came and lived with us in the last 12 years, and I would take him. Well, he was still driving up until about 98. I mean, my husband actually took him. Fort Collins is not that big, but it's about 150,000. So he would take my dad to the interstate exchange because my dad was not really liking at 98 to drive in town. And then he'd point him north and he would drive up to Montana. I mean, he was fine on the roads, he was, but he just hated it. So, but when I would travel back to go visit relatives in Montana or go back to Bismarck, because he still had a lot of friends. Marie Tyler was just a dear friend of ours, and she lost her husband. My dad lost his wife, so they became travel partners as well. And she's beloved by our family. But when I would go back with him, invariably I'd learn something new. We'd go by a road, and he'd say, "Oh, down that county road was that rancher so-and-so." And I remember we had a bull sale that he would remember that
everything.
I remember that he took out a full page ad in the Hereford Journal. He just had a memory like a trap. He could just remember it all. It was so amazing. And again, always so interested in the other person. Our daughter is getting her PhD in neuroscience. Talk about an area where I know nothing about, you know. So she would send her papers that she's written that got into a journal or something, and we would read them, but we didn't get it. My dad, he would read it with real intent, pull out his dictionary, look up things that he did. And so when she came, he actually had serious, smart questions to ask her. Where my husband and I were like, yeah, we don't understand it, you know, but he would take the time.
Good for him.
Yeah.
What a guy.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. When you went to college, yeah, I remember what it was like when I went to college and had to say goodbye to dad and mom after they moved me into the dorm. What was it like for you when you started college and left the home of Clair Michels?
Right, right. Well, I luckily stayed home for the first 2 years because it was BJC at the time, BSC now.
Yep.
And I went to, so it was just sort of understood that you go there. And then I went to Iowa State, and I actually went back to Iowa State last week. We were traveling, visiting some friends in Iowa, and I hadn't been back on campus since 1980. I couldn't believe it. And I walked by the dorm where I was, and I told my husband this story of how my parents had driven me down and got me into the dorm room. And of course, I was feeling frisky and like, here I am, here's college, big time college. And my parents said they got in the car and they cried all the way back to Bismarck, North Dakota. They couldn't even look at each other, you know, because it suddenly was really quiet at home. So I really reflected on that, because that's exactly how I felt when I took my kids to school. It's like, oh my goodness, you know, I honestly think it was harder on them than me because it was a new adventure. And, you know, I called them every week or wrote letters, of course, but calling was expensive back then. It wasn't like you just picked up your cell phone, you know. So it was an adjustment for all of us.
That's right.
Yes. Did he ever give you any wise words? That when you were out on your own, did he write a note to you or share them to you?
Absolutely, and to my husband, who really took his jobs real seriously and get a little wound up. And my dad would always say, "The pay is the same. The pay is the same on whether you get all wound up or not. So just relax, you know, just relax and take it as it comes, you know." One thing he used to laugh at, my husband was kind of a big cyclist and he would ride his bike an awful lot. But my dad also said, you only have so many heartbeats in life. Why waste them on exercise? And he lived to 105. So
did he ever ride a bike?
My dad? I never saw him ride a bike. He walked a lot. You know, he was always physically out there and walked a lot and did yard work and, you know, all that kind of stuff. But
do you have anything tangible that reminds you of your dad, or it's just so heartwarming to know that you have this, whatever it is, this tangible item?
Wow.
Or would you say the memories are not tangible, but what is tangible?
Right. I have a little box that's got a silver top with a little football player on it. And that was his little box when he graduated from high school. And in there is his class ring, which he said he had to scrape to come up with that $6 to buy that class ring. And he's got some little metal things from the war, from World War II. So that little box has a lot of packed memories in it. I would say that's kind of a talisman right there.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Did your grandchildren feel the same warmth and connection to him as you had? Or I'm sorry, to your children and your grandchildren?
My children. Yeah. My grandchildren are too little at this point, but they did. And they knew him for 30 and 32 years. So I'm really like, you know, being an only child, you worry. I feel like both your parents are gone, you don't have siblings, who's carrying on the memories? And so my husband, having known him for so long, and my children having known him for so long, they really do have those warm feelings for him. They saw the character that he had, And yeah.
Yeah.
In his retirement, one of the things that he did when they went to, they spent a couple months in Arizona one year, and he just, he just couldn't sit around. And so he found somebody who was teaching how to do silversmithing. And he started collecting turquoise and making rings and pendants. And I have a little book where he wrote down the date and who he made a ring for. And every time somebody, a cousin or somebody would come to the house, like those last 12 years, he would say, "What's your ring size? Here, try it." And he'd have them put that little thing. He'd find out their ring size. He'd make them something and send it on the way. So, yeah. So
what a treasure.
He wanted to keep busy.
Mm-hmm. Yes. What a rich, full life.
Yeah.
Did he ever want to go back to the ranch and be immersed in livestock again?
He loved going back. One of my cousins does run cattle on the old ranch right now. So he loved going back and talking the talk, finding out what's going on, talking, writing. He loved that. He also loved farm machinery. And one of his brothers was probably the largest collector in Montana, in Miles City, Jim Michels. And he had hundreds of old farm machinery. And my dad loved that. And actually he left Bismarck and lived in Miles City before he came to live with us in Colorado. He lived there for about 8 years and was immersed in that farm machinery. Let me tell you, he had an old Brumley that he got to work in and just loved that lifestyle. And so he had 2 brothers in Miles City. So the 3 of them had some really good years and really good years when it came to all that farm machinery. It's funny. I have a friend in town who has an old John Deere. And I said, "Dad, we need to go see Mike's John Deere." We get there. It was like from the 1950s, right? And my dad, "This is not old."
Mary Ann, in concluding our fun chat, if there is one memory that you would, of your dad, especially your mom and dad, but we're kind of pointing out your dad, Clair Michels, how can you leave the conversation today and inspire our viewers?
Well, he was asked many times, "How are you living such a long life? What's your secret?" And maybe I'll leave you with, what he always said about his secret. And that was that he tried to eat well every day. He likes to say it was oatmeal in the morning. That was the thing that did it. He likes to move every day. He would always go for a little walk around the property. Even the last years he was in a walker, the last 2 years using a walker. Find things that you love to do. And he had so many hobbies and so many interests. And then the last thing was, think about the other person. Always look outwards instead of inwards.
Good advice.
Yes, folks, that is a wonderful note on which to end our conversation with Mary Ann Michels, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Clair Michels, very influential folks in the ranching industry and the beef cattle industry in North Dakota. Thank you, Mary Ann.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Our pleasure. And now, viewers, I'd like to leave you with a couple of things to look at. Do you see that blue thumbs up button? Please click that, and the red subscribe button. We would appreciate it if you touch that. And until next time, tell your relatives and your friends, everyone you see, about the 1950s Fun Chat. So till next time, toodaloo.